We're here with Dave Stovall. First, could you tell us about yourself, who you are, where you're from, and how your narrative has shaped your experience as a critical race theory scholar?
Definitely. Thanks so much. My name is Dave Stovall again. I'm from the south side of Chicago. I'm born and raised there. The schools that I actually attended both have closed, my grade school and my high school. And in terms of experiences around coming to critical race theory, becoming a critical race scholar, there was always this thing with me about school. Something wasn't right? If it was like the problems with the Columbus story, if it was this lining up, it was always something. I didn't know what it was. I couldn't articulate it, but I knew I was feeling like something was happening that shouldn't be happening. And it took a while for me to break from that, right? And I had a teacher, I had a 4th grade teacher and I had an 8th grade teacher. And they were both like, look, you have to figure out what education is for you, right? All this other stuff around having to fill out forms and tests and fill out bubbles, that's not what this thing is. Education is something where you can ask questions of your reality and then work with others to change the reality. So for me, that was large in terms of understanding critical race theory, right? So when I first heard that racism is ingrained in the policy structures of US society, the first thing I'm thinking about is my grade school experience. This is what this is, right? This is where the lies start. So critical race theory breaks that up. So it was a point of familiarity that brought me to CRT in terms of thinking about its tenets, in terms of thinking about what folks were doing in the past, because it wasn't as if CRT was something new, but CRT was a reminder, right? It was a reminder that folks have always resisted white supremacy, and they've always resisted white supremacy in education. So now, how do we begin to think about our work in a way that has those same interruptions? So me coming up as a Chicagoan, understanding segregation in a different way. I come from a deeply segregated city, one of the most segregated cities in the world, actually. And there are views and understandings and rationales coming up where you saw very clearly who was valued, and you also saw very clearly who was disposable. So coming to CRT was just the affirmation of that, right? And understanding that these things are not happenstance, but deeply ingrained into society, our policies, and the rationales for implementing those policies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it definitely sounds like that really shaped your experience. Going along with that, what are some projects around critical race theory that you're currently working on, or some recent things that you've done regarding this?
Well, for me, in terms of some stuff that I've done in the past, so I was on the design team for a high school called the Greater Lawndale Little Village School for Social Justice. And it wasn't this process of saying, well, let's do a CRT project at a high school. It wasn't that. It was more about communities determining what constituted a quality education. And then as someone who engaged in critical race praxis, right? So looking at the conceptual, the material, the performative, and the reflexive, and saying, how are we actually enacting that in school space? So as a member of the design team, I started to do a couple of things. One, I began to think about how do we actively interrupt the colonial relationship between universities and community spaces? Because the university often operates as the extractor, right? It's always taking something from folks. And instead of enacting in that kind of colonial project, what we were thinking about was, well, what do we as people employed at universities give back to community space? And so for 13 years, I team taught a class there. So now that I work in that particular class, I used to teach that class with one of my undergraduate students, and now another one of my undergraduate students has taken over that class. Currently, I'm working on this project that I'm referring to as engineered conflict. So in Chicago, we have quite a few homicides, and it's come into this deepening of the criminalization of young folks. And instead of thinking about young people in this false natural propensity to crime, it's really around saying, well, if we think about how conflict operates, then cities can actually engineer conflict between people. And something like critical race theory says, we now get even clearer about who is valued when we look at gentrification in terms of who's pushed out and who comes in. We're reminded in terms of who is valued in terms of what schools are in particular communities in relationship to the housing stock. We are reminded who is valued in terms of relationships with law enforcement, in terms of police shootings, complaints against police. And we also see it in relationship to essentially the end of high-rise public housing, right? So now, through a critical race theory lens, I'm asking, instead of thinking about young people with high propensities to crime, why aren't we asking deeper questions of our cities that have actually deemed that group of young people disposable, right? So that's the newest project.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up on that, you teach in K through 12 as well, and teach as a professor at University of Illinois, Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
As an educator and scholar, how does that influence the work that you do with younger students? Because that's a very powerful experience to have.
I think each group informs the other, right? So working with high schoolers informs how I interact with undergrads. Interacting with graduate students deeply informs how I engage with high schoolers and undergrads. So it's always thinking about how these spaces are mixing with each other. So this morning, I talked to a group of high schoolers, and then later on in the morning, I was interviewed by a group of 7th graders, mm-hmm. right? And they were deeply engaged in the process, and it's always pushing me to think about what constitutes engagement, mm-hmm. right? Because I think a lot of times as teachers, we get full of ourselves. Well, what's wrong with you, young person? I got all the knowledge. Why aren't you doing what I'm saying? And literally the young person is looking at you like, because you're whack, you're terrible, mm-hmm. right? So this thing around really being intentional about that, right? It also deeply impacts humility, mm-hmm. right? Because if you're willing to go into a space where people do not care that you have a PhD, then you got to do something different, mm-hmm. right? And I always appreciate that, because in academia, we lie to ourselves, right? We lie to ourselves about expertise. We lie to ourselves about being all-knowing, right? In fact, in real time, getting a PhD really is just an affirmation of how much you really don't know, mm-hmm. right? So this thing around really, I think those spaces deeply inform my humility and keep me grounded and not trying to think of myself as someone who is expert, right? But someone who is also struggling, because we're also engaging in these places.
Yes, absolutely. And that's definitely a wonderful mindset to have for the important work that we do. All right, so let's dive into this discussion of critical race theory. It's safe to say that many politicians and those in positions of power are pushing this narrative of critical race theory. And for the most part, they are very much so misinformed. Utilize this platform, this space, to educate us about the history of critical race theory and its tenets.
Definitely. Thank you for that, because I think a lot of times in the current moment, we get into this conversation about what critical race theory is not. And I think when we shift it and talk about what critical race theory is, now we can get down to the details of why this has become a straw person, right? And critical race theory was a theoretical paradigm that was responding to legal scholarship that was called critical legal studies. The idea of critical legal studies was the idea that the criminal legal system in the United States is a system based on class. In 1973, Derek Bell wrote a book called Race, Racism, and American Law. He was responding to critical legal studies and saying, The U.S. criminal legal system is not just a system based on class, but it is also a system that is deeply ingrained in race, age, gender, disability, and sexual orientation. And if we don't talk about race and what race is connected to, we're missing the point. A group of his students had a conference in 1989 at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this is when we first see the term critical race theory. Now, they incorporate a couple of concepts from Derek Bell, one being interest convergence, which is the idea that mainstream white society will only advance racial justice to the extent that mainstream white society remains in power. Another concept is racial realism, that is talking about the endemic nature of racism in the United States. And then other folks like Kimberly Crenshaw, like Cheryl Harris, like Angela Harris, advanced the construct and said we also need to think about intersectionality. So we do not just experience the world as raced people, but we experience the world as raced, class, gendered, aged, in relationship to our sexual orientation and disability. You had other folks who were saying we also need to think about how race is malleable, right? So Richard Delgado and Gene Stefancic talked about racial differentialization, right? So now this was the idea that members of certain groups, according to the United States, their race can actually shift, right? So we see this where we get the term model minority and we stereotype that to Asian American and Pacific Islander folks. But the term actually was used originally to describe Latinx folks, right? So this thing around, and then even when we talk about the war on terror, so where it was now castigating Arab, North African folks, they were actually considered part of that model minority, right? I mean, in even stranger instances, if you were from Ethiopia, because the Caucasus Mountains run through Ethiopia and Caucasians are descendants of the Caucasus Mountains, Ethiopians were counted as white in the United States until the 90s, right? So this thing around, so you had people who were reading this, and more importantly for our work in education, Gloria Ladson-Billings and Bill Tate in 1995 write an article called Towards a Critical Race Theory of Education. And in that process, people began to talk about, well, the same thing that is happening in the criminal legal system is also happening in our schools. We're seeing young people be castigated. We see this deficit narrative. We see people actually rationalizing what to do to Black and brown students, but we also see resistance. So folks like Danny Solorzano, Dolores Delgado Bernal, Octavio Villalpando, and all of their students now started to kind of grow this space. I come from a branch of critical race theory that is referenced as critical race praxis, which I appreciate because it's challenging us to think about spending less time with abstract theory and more time in the world with people who are experiencing injustice, because at any given time, it could be us. So that's this kind of broad overview of CRT, and I think it's important because the argument often is that this is being taught in schools to now make students racist, right? So, and this is always a thing in schools, right? When you talk about race, you instantaneously become racist, right? When in actuality, you're saying we really have to confront historical accuracy. That is the question here. And why are we fearful of being historically accurate? And I think that's the broader question, and how CRT, we can talk about Christopher Rufo and him talking about microaggressions on Fox News. Donald Trump sees him, and then he comes out with Executive Order 13950. But the idea here is really, the United States got shook in the summer of 2020. And to make sure that that never happens again, you have to take away the things that allow young people to ask questions. And again, it's nothing new, right? We've seen this with the 30s and the Smith Act. We've seen this under McCarthy with the House Un-American Activities Committee. So this current attack on CRT and actually historical accuracy is part of that chain, right? So the United States constantly reminds us of how it has been ensconced in racist praxis.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a wonderful explanation of the history of critical race theory and its tenets. Let's push this conversation a little bit further. What are your thoughts around the current discourse around critical race theory in the United States today?
Right. I mean, it is a deeply organized populist campaign against it, right? This idea that CRT against teaching folk how to be racist, and it's what's the other one thing? It's influencing, it's manipulating the minds of young people. You know, all of this particular rhetoric, but in actuality, there's something that mainstream white society has often found difficult to do, and that's control its own children. And when the children of these folks ask a different set of questions, they move even harder to repress the capacity to ask those questions, right? So as much as it is this broad attack on engaging in historical accuracy, underneath that attack is folks on what we would refer to as the conservative right being fearful of a transitioning happening at the dinner table, right? So this thing around really putting that into conversation, and that's where they won't go. And another space where the detractors of CRT won't go, say, well, okay, well, look, if historical accuracy is the problem, what do you want taught? And that's usually where the conversation stops, right? So you see people taking over school boards or what have you. It's like, all right, y'all, well, what do you want to be taught here? And what is, and this is always, and they use the rhetoric of age appropriateness. But folks in critical race theory, folks in ethnic studies, folks in critical pedagogy say, well, if a young person is old enough to experience white supremacy in the form of marginalization, isolation, and containment, then they're old enough to be engaged with historical accuracy, right? And pushing back on what are we really fearful of, right? And that's I think the current moment disallows for that conversation to happen.
So let's be specific to the state of Nevada. And Nevada public schools, educators are allowed to incorporate broad concepts like social justice and equity into the curriculum. However, educators are not allowed to use words or frame these concepts under the tenets of critical race theory. And as a result of that, a lot of the history, these histories remain invisible or silenced or unspoken. How do we create an inclusive education reform in this state? How can we do that if we're not including these important histories that we don't want to discuss?
Right. I mean, I think you all in Nevada are at a precipice, right? It's going to take folks, you know, I'm not a fan of terms like reform, right? Because it's never enough, right? And are we engaging something that was never really intended to work, right? I think that's the scary question, right? Are we willing to engage something that was never really meant to serve the people that are in it? So now, if we think about that, are we willing to say, well, what does it mean for folks to stand up? How are we denying historical accuracy, right? And it's an interesting piece because you all in Nevada had the last time I was out here pre-COVID, it was teachers all lined up in the street because you all were supposed to get cannabis money to go to schools. And they didn't do it right in terms of its transfer, in terms of getting cannabis money to schools, right? So I'm always thinking, well, there's already been a space where people are fighting for their right to engage. Now, how do we re-engage that energy, right? And say, look, what do we want taught here if we cannot mention things that may be controversial? What are we doing? What is the whitewashing trying to do? So again, I think this moment in Nevada is for people to stand up. Right, I know that might not make the tape, right, in terms of people actually calling for an uprising, right? I mean, dare we say it, right? Because this thing around we have to be clear about what does it mean. We live in a society that is constantly moved to erase us. And we're just going to sit back and let it happen again, right? So now the fight is on, right? And we have to be willing, we have to act like we're in a fight, right? Because a lot of times in education, we try to nice things to people, right? We try to nice our way out of things, right? And in actuality, we're still engaging in this pain and degradation. Let's end it for what it is, right? And now, what are we willing to do, right? So I think this is the prime moment for teachers and young folks to raise up, right? And ask a different question of folks in relationship to what's being included in the curriculum, right? This is that moment.
Yes. No, I think that's a wonderful suggestion. Now, we often get asked the question from pre-service teachers and in-service teachers, how can we disguise sort of teaching critical race theory so that we can teach these important histories without running into the trouble that you spoke about before, but to include these narratives?
Right. And I think this is always a thing. When we're talking about white supremacy, we got to be clear. And when I say white supremacy, I'm specifically talking about the assumed views and values of white, Western European descended, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual males as normal, right, and good. And everything else has been othered, has been made strange. So if we're thinking about white supremacy, now we have to think about how do we act in ways that are fugitive, right? And fugitive meaning that there is this accepted way, and then there is the necessity of breaking rules, right? Because there's a difference between justice and legality, right? Legality just says that these are the strategies of obedience. Justice says this is what people need. So now, if we think about that particular navigation, I think one of the pieces is the use of primary documents, right? Because the Nevada State Board of Education standards say that students should be able to use primary documents and write expository essays. They didn't say about what. So now we have to use that particular conduit to say, all right, let's engage in Nevada's historical record. Let's not use any conjecture about what folk meant. Let's look at the record and let's look at what happened and as people interpreted this particular record. I think that's a really important piece because a lot of young teachers are being scapegoated, but there also a lot of fear is being put in them because these things have now become controversial. But when you say, look, I'm just talking about the historical record, but I think another thing in the training of teachers, we have to be willing to prepare folks for when the enemy comes. Because as soon as you claim justice, they are coming. They will be at your front door. You have to prepare for them, right? You can't be blindsided by them, right? So when they come, you say, look, we on page 48. We're looking at the Nevada registry and how folks were kicked off land and silver mines were created, right? So this thing around being deeply intentional and using the historical record for our protection in a particular way. And even with that, they're still gonna come, right? So I think it's really around, we're talking about being able to navigate things fugitively, but we're also preparing ourselves for when we are confronted.
Thank you for that wonderful explanation. So just to expand upon the previous point and thinking about K through 12 education, what are some best practices that teachers can design and implement to support the history of these silenced narratives?
I think what's critical is that we have to have spaces where we are supporting a critical inquiry, right? Where we have young people being able to ask questions of their world and what it is that they are seeing. So now, when they are asking questions about what it is that they're seeing, we can now pull in resources to now further lift up that conversation, right? And I think that's the thing that people fear the most, because young folks got questions, right? And they got a lot of questions that we don't necessarily have answers to, right? So I think that's really important to keep that high, right? So those 7th graders who interviewed me this morning were interviewing me about a protest in 1963 and its connection to a protest that happened in 2001, right? So they're trying, as 7th graders, they're trying to figure out the connective tissues. So now, again, we're using the historical record to support the capacity of young people to engage critically. I think as practice, when we think about our assessments no longer as regurgitating issues, right, back to us, right? Because a lot of times schooling becomes like vomiting, right? Somebody's dumping, something's forcing something on you, and then you vomit it back out, and then you get a grade. But instead, saying, well, what does it mean to ask questions of our reality? What questions emanate from our particular study, our conversations? And I think that's a way to keep our criticality high, but also remind everyone, teacher and young person, that we're all engaged in a process of learning, right? There's never a moment that as an older person that I'm not learning. So having a space where we have tangible examples of that. I think those are, in opposed to saying, here's the manual for best practice, but saying, here's what we can now begin to think about, and that plays itself out differently depending on our classrooms.
Absolutely. In thinking about the work that we do as educators, how can we utilize the tenets of critical race theory or the framework of critical race theory to better support Black and Brown communities?
I think this is where critical race praxis really becomes important to me, right? So Eric Yamamoto was a law professor at Southwestern College in Los Angeles, and his students were running a legal clinic, and they saw people in the garment district in LA who were experiencing wage theft. So he started working with this particular community of garment workers, and they were Black, Latinx, Southeast Asian, and from that grouping of people. And in documenting it, he came out with this thing, and he was reading Paulo Freire in terms of praxis being action and reflection in the world in order to change it. So one of the things that I think is really useful now in terms of critical race praxis are those 4 tenets, right? The conceptual, right? How do we now think about what it is that we're doing? So the concept is clear to us in terms of where our work lies. The second is the material. So now that you've come up with the concept, what resources do you need to enact that concept? The third one being the performative. Now that you have a concept, you have your resources, what are you actually doing in those classrooms, right? What is the pedagogical practice that you are engaging? How are you engaging students? How are you engaging families? For what purpose? And the fourth one, which is kind of amalgamation of the first 3, being the reflexive. So now in our space and in our humility, we're willing to say what went well, what didn't go well, and now what are we willing to improve? And I think that really becomes important when we talk about a very heightened moment in education and really kind of asking deeper questions of the school, right? And now even being pushed farther is saying, well, look, is this thing irredeemable? And even if it is, what are we willing to do, right? So this thing around really kind of thinking about education is very different from schooling, right? Because schooling becomes the order and compliance. Education is asking deeper questions of that order and compliance with maybe an understanding that that order and compliance should not exist. Dare we say a word like abolition, right? So this thing around really being clear about that. And I completely confess that that's part of a radical imaginary, but it's a radical imaginary that I'm tapping into that folks have done centuries before me, right? So now, how am I responsible to that historical record when we're talking about what can be done?
Thank you for that explanation. As we wrap up our time together, is there anything else about critical race theory, the intersection of critical race theory and upon K through 12 education, whether it be students, teachers in our community, that you would like to share?
I think there is, get accused a lot for inciting things, but I think it's just, we have to tell the truth about this, right? We're in a fight, right? Folks have come for our throats, right? And now it's not about trying to return fire in the same way, but it's really around deepening our commitment, So now in our classrooms, how do we deepen our commitment? How do we deepen strategies and practices that take from all of these particular disciplines, whether it be gender and women's studies, ethnic studies, whether it be critical analysis, critical race theory, racial contract theory? How do we take from these spaces and now create a space and protect this space where young folks can ask questions of their world and build with others to change our reality, right? We're at that moment. The beauty of this moment is that many of us have waited for this, and we are prepared, right? So this thing around now, the work is in front of us. We have to do it. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it, right? And I think that's important during these moments of explicit attack.
David Stovall, thank you so much for this wonderful, insightful conversation, and I am excited to hear how this will be impactful for our educators. Thank you so much.
Appreciate you, man.
For joining us this afternoon.
Indeed.